Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Kyle Kondik. I'm managing editor of Sabato's Crystal Ball. We're a political handicapping election analysis newsletter out of the University of Virginia Center for Politics. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C., where I live and work. I'm originally from the Cleveland area, Independence, and I'm a proud graduate of Ohio University. And as an Ohio University graduate, I can tell you I'm very familiar with your products and I like them very much. So with that, just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the election. I'm going to look mostly national, but I've got some points I want to make specifically about Ohio, and then I'd be happy to take any questions as you might have. And, one thing I think has been very striking about the election so far is that you went from a time where, I think the president had a lot of things going for him just in terms of the state of the country, and that whatever people felt about the president, and he is certainly a polarizing figure, but that we were basically in a time of relative peace and prosperity. A lot of people were happy with the state of the economy. We weren't embroiled in any sort of major foreign conflict like Iraq or Korea or Vietnam, et cetera. And, I think you could argue that in some ways the president's standing was actually maybe weaker than it could or should have been given the state of the country earlier this year and for much of his presidency. Then, of course, the pandemic hit and we had the resulting economic repercussions and the massive disruptions to people's daily lives. And yet the numbers haven't really changed all that much since before the pandemic. And so you go from a time where people feel really good about the country to a time where people feel bad about the country, and yet the electorate doesn't seem to have moved a whole lot. And let me just put that in perspective for you. So there are two major poll aggregators that sort of average the national and state level polls that we look at a lot. One is Real Clear Politics. The other one is 538, Nate Silver's site. And so on March 1st, so that's basically just when the pandemic is kind of starting to come into people's minds, but we're before the point where it's really disrupted a lot of people's lives. So on that date, March 1st, in the Real Clear Politics national polling average, Donald Trump's approval rating was, his approval was 6 points lower than his disapproval. So he was -6 net approval, which is not good, but it's also not horrible. In 538, he was a little bit worse. They have a slightly different way of averaging things. But Trump was at -9 net approval nationally. And that's kind of where his approval's been for much of his presidency. As we sit here this morning, Trump's approval rating in Real Clear Politics was -9. It was -9.5 in 538. So in 538, it's hardly changed really in aggregate. Real Clear Politics is a little bit weaker. And then if you also look at how Biden and Trump were performing head-to-head in horse race polls nationally, Biden, which on March 1st, he was not yet the presumptive Democratic nominee. That March 1st was right after he won South Carolina. It was a couple days before Super Tuesday on March 3rd, where Biden really took command of winning the Democratic nomination. But head-to-head against Trump, Biden was +5 in Real Clear Politics, and he was +4 in 538. As of this morning, he's +7 in both of those averages. And so, again, for all of the changes in the country, the president's position, I think, is weaker, but it's not markedly weaker. Maybe you could say that he is 2 or 3 points worse in terms of approval now than he was before the pandemic. And so, one of the striking things about the Trump era has been that there have been all these massive events and news stories that have happened, impeachment, obviously more recently with the pandemic and the economic crisis. People's perceptions of the president don't really change all that much. And I think it speaks to how kind of locked in a lot of the electorate is, basically being either for the president or against him. That said, there are some differences in some of these polls that I think are worth talking about, and just where the electorate is right now. And if you look at sort of the polls right now compared to where they were in 2016, first of all, the parties are more united in that the president is stronger with self-identified Republicans than he was 4 years ago, which makes some sense given that I think there were a lot of Republicans who were sort of suspicious of Trump. They wondered if he was elected, if he would govern as a conservative. I think he basically has governed as a conservative. And I think he's won over some of the holdouts in his own party. That's not to say all the holdouts, but most of them. And Biden also is achieving more party unity than Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago. I think a lot of that has to do with Trump himself, in that a lot of Democratic voters are likely to say they're voting against Trump as opposed to for Biden. Republicans are likely to say they're casting more of an affirmative vote for Trump as opposed to against Biden. Back in 2016, independent voters, they were generally split and kind of confused about what choice they would make. Trump eventually won self-identified independent voters in the election. Biden generally leads with independents right now. Usually the person who wins independence is likelier to win, but there have been instances where the person who's lost independence has gone on to win the election. George W. Bush in 2004 lost independence, and so did Barack Obama in 2012, and both of them still won re-election. And also, there are fewer voters saying they're going to vote third party this time. Yes, there is a Green Party candidate and a Libertarian Party candidate. Kanye West is also on the ballot in some states, although he's really not on the ballot in any of the really important states. But the third party vote combined in 2016 was about 6%, which is actually relatively high. People who did not vote for either Clinton or Trump in 2016. And what you see in polls generally is that the third party candidates usually poll better than they actually perform on election day. I think it's easy for people to say in the summertime, hey, yeah, I'll vote Libertarian, I'll vote Green. But then at the end of the day, they get to the ballot and they say, hey, wait a second, I know that the person I'm going to vote for isn't going to win. Let me vote for a candidate who would win, and it's one of the two major party candidates. So the poll support for third party candidates usually goes down anyway, but it's even lower this time than it was 4 years ago, and so there are fewer undecideds as well. And so generally speaking, the polls are a little more stable, but the same dynamics exist as existed in 2016, in that Biden, whatever his odds are to win the national popular vote, those are higher than his chance of winning the Electoral College, because the president seems to do a little bit better in the most important swing states than he's doing nationally. And so if Trump wins again, my guess is that he would not be winning the popular vote if he won again, whereas Biden probably needs to win the popular vote by at least 3, 4, 5 points to sort of set up the scenario in which he is getting over 270 electoral votes. In terms of changes from 2016, in terms of different kind of demographic groups, one thing I think is striking is that Democrats usually do extremely well with non-white voters, so Black voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters, et cetera. Usually a Democrat's going to be winning maybe 3/4 or so of those voters in the electorate. And Biden is really not doing any better with non-white voters than Hillary Clinton did last year. And in fact, there's some indication that Biden is doing a little bit worse with Latinos, and that he may need to catch up with that group. And that's particularly important in some of the more diverse Sunbelt states like Florida and Arizona. But Biden is doing better than Clinton did with white voters, specifically white voters who have a 4-year college degree. There's been this huge split amongst white voters, and this was true before Trump, but it's really become more prevalent since Trump got elected. And that is that white voters who don't have a 4-year college degree used to, a few generations ago, sort of form the bedrock of the Democratic Party, and white voters with a 4-year degree kind of form the bedrock of the Republican Party. Well, their roles have kind of switched, in that white voters with a 4-year degree have become more Democratic leaning. You can really see that in a state like Ohio. If you look at a place, some of the kind of more affluent, highly educated suburbs around Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, you saw Trump usually doing kind of worse in those places than Mitt Romney had done in 2012. But then also places that are sort of more white working class. And so some of the inner ring suburbs of Cleveland, a lot of the more rural kind of small town areas across the state, you saw Trump do a lot better than Romney did. So that dynamic played out in Ohio, and it played out all over the country. Trump is still winning white voters without a 4-year degree by a lot. It's just that his margins aren't quite as big as they were in the polls right now. And Biden is doing a lot better with white voters with a 4-year degree. And so again, you'll probably see that in the results in, again, some of those suburban areas around the three big cities. I'm expecting that Biden will run significantly ahead of Clinton in a lot of those places. Trump's path to reelection, I think Biden, I think, is favored as you look at the numbers right now. And I'll go through the specific electoral college map in a little bit, but what is the president's path? I mean, I think there's a number of things. I think people have been fairly critical of his handling of coronavirus, but perhaps coronavirus won't be as salient to the election in November as maybe it seems now, and perhaps the trajectory of coronavirus will be better. Maybe there'll be a vaccine that is sort of broadly accepted, although that would be a very, very quick turnaround time for a vaccine, given how these things usually go. There have been, certainly over the summer, a lot of protests over racial inequities in policing. There have been a lot of peaceful protests, but there have also been instances of violence that the president and I think Republicans have sort of sought to highlight as kind of excesses of protests that the Democrats are essentially condoning. That's always kind of an explosive issue in American politics, and one wonders if the president might eventually be able to get some sort of advantage on that issue. We haven't necessarily seen that yet, but that's certainly a possibility. The second quarter GDP growth number, predictably because of all the coronavirus shutdowns, was historically horrible this year. However, third quarter is probably going to be really good because a lot of places are bouncing back, and the restrictions from coronavirus have been lessened in some places. And so perhaps the president, after getting bad economic news earlier in the year, might get better economic news, and that may remind voters that despite not liking Trump, generally speaking, more voters are likelier to say that they approve of Trump on the economy specifically. That's an advantage that the president has retained even in the midst of this economic dislocation. I think people believe that whatever they think of how Trump has responded to coronavirus, that they're not necessarily blaming him for the economic fallout from that. And, we did have two of the big events, the election season, obviously the conventions. The conventions were virtual. They were not particularly well watched. And I don't think you can really point to the conventions as having changed the race all that much. The debates are going to be starting. The first one is September 29th. Very curious to see if there is any fallout from the debates. We'll have the three normal presidential debates, and then also the vice presidential debate. So those are opportunities, I think, for maybe the president to get a little bit closer. And I think that the job for the president really, in particular, if you look at a state like Ohio or a state like Pennsylvania or Michigan, is I do think he's going to lose more ground in the suburbs. I think there's a lot of data that sort of backs that up. So then the question is, particularly for like Pennsylvania and Michigan that were so close last time, can he do even better in some of the more kind of rural small town areas that really liked Trump a lot in 2016? And I think it's quite possible that he could. But that's something I think he's going to need to do, because I think the suburban city vote is probably going to continue to move against the president based on the data we have. Bottom line is, I think there are a lot of people who probably don't really trust the polls after 2016. I'm happy to talk about some of the methodology questions about some of the polling and what has and maybe hasn't changed. But I basically believe this, that I think if Trump is going to win, the polls will get closer in that, the national polls really were relatively close at the end last time. Clinton was up by maybe 3 or 4 points in aggregate. She won the national popular vote by 2. That's not some sort of extraordinary miss. And I think maybe some of the swing state polls will get closer, as I think they have, particularly a state like Florida, for instance, which is always very close. The polls there have really got much closer after sort of widening out in summertime. So I don't, I think if Trump is going to win, the numbers will look different than they do today. And also remember that, as I said before, I think that the president does maintain a little bit of an advantage in the most important swing states, in that whatever the decisive swing state is in 2016, it was essentially Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania together. Trump won those states all by a little less than a percentage point apiece, and had Clinton won those states, she would have won the election. But those states all voted about 2 to 3 points to the right of the nation. And that's probably what we're going to see in 2020 as well, that the most decisive swing states, whatever they are, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, are good candidates. Florida might be in that mix as well, Arizona. Those states probably will vote a little bit more Republican than the nation as a whole does. So with that, I just got a few maps I want to show you, and then I'm happy to take some questions. Okay. So these are our electoral college ratings. So we do, we rate all the states from safe Republican to safe Democratic. Dark red is safe Republican, dark blue is safe Democratic. You can see kind of the basic outline of what our political coalitions are today. The Democrats really do well kind of in the northeastern corridor in New England. They also do really well on the West Coast. The Republicans tend to dominate in a lot of the interior western states and also much of the South. The Midwest has often been and remains kind of the one very consistently competitive region throughout the country, in that usually the candidate that wins a majority of the Midwestern states, depending on how you define the Midwest, ends up winning the election. Pennsylvania, though technically in the Northeast, is really part of that collection of states. And so what our own ratings we have right now, we have Biden at 269 electoral votes, at least leaning to him, Trump at 204, and then 65 electoral votes worth of toss-ups, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and Wisconsin. There are a whole lot of different scenarios you could look at here. One little, the crazy scenario would be if there actually was a 269 to 269 tie in the Electoral College. In that case, the newly elected U.S. House would break the tie in January. But there's a catch in that the Democrats control the House majority right now, and that the Democrats have more seats, and that they're likely to hold more seats next year, no matter what happens in the presidential election. However, the way the vote is actually cast is that all of the 50 states get to cast a single vote. And so California, with 53 House seats, cast the same number of votes as Wyoming, that has 1. And the Republicans actually control 26 of the 50 U.S. House delegations, meaning that even though they're in the minority, the structure of a electoral college tiebreaker vote would actually favor them. So if you're thinking about the electoral college, the magic number for Biden is 270, but really the magic number for Trump is 269. So that's just something to keep in mind, and that would be a crazy scenario if it happened. I think a lot of people would be rightly kind of confused if Democrats had more seats in the House, but actually the Republicans had the advantage in this tiebreaker situation. But we're probably not going to have to deal with that, although 2020 has been such a crazy year that you can never rule it out. But again, I think that the states that are getting the most attention are six states that were all won by Trump in 2016, 3 in the industrial north, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and then 3 in the Sun Belt, North Carolina, Florida, and Arizona. I suspect that whichever candidate wins a majority of those states will win the election, and then it's really close if they split 3-3. Some other states are I think, also competitive. The Trump campaign would love to flip Minnesota and Nevada, which both were very close in 2016. The Biden camp, I think, is looking at Georgia, is continuing to look at Ohio, Iowa, even Texas. But fundamentally, I think those 6 states I mentioned are really the key ones to consider. Let me talk about Ohio really quick. And I apologize, you probably can't read the text on this map, but the colors are more important than the actual text. And so this is the 2012 Obama versus Romney map on your left, and then it's the Trump versus Clinton map on the right. And what happened in Ohio in 2016 is that obviously the state shifted very significantly to the right, in that Obama won it by about 3 points, and then Trump won it by 8. So that's an 11-point swing in terms of margin. And really where you saw this was outside the big cities. And so here, there are a few striking statistics about it. The first one is that if you take the three big urban counties, so Cuyahoga County, Cleveland, Franklin County, Columbus, Hamilton County, Cincinnati, in terms of margin, Hillary Clinton did only about 5,600 votes worse than Obama, meaning that Clinton lost hardly any ground in those three counties combined. They cast a little less than a third of the statewide vote. In the other 85 counties, Clinton's margin was 607,000 votes worse than Obama's was. So again, the Clinton lost this race not because of the three big urban counties and turnout. She lost it because she got wiped out outside the three big urban counties. You really can see it on the map. Clinton carried Summit County, Lucas, barely carried Youngstown, Mahoning County, which historically been very Democratic. And the margins, the red counties in the Romney map got a lot redder on the Trump map. And another statistic that I think is striking is that Ohio has 16 congressional districts, and one of them, Ohio 6, basically covers the territory that you see in that Southeast Ohio portion that's broken out on this map. So it goes from a little bit south of Youngstown all the way to the southern tip of the state. That's Congressman Bill Johnson's district. Ted Strickland used to hold a version of that district in the 2000s. Used to be pretty competitive. Mitt Romney carried that district by about 12 points in 2012. So it was clearly getting more Republican, but was still competitive. Donald Trump carried it by 42 points in 2016. So that was a 30-point swing to the right. No congressional district in the entire country, all 435 of them, shifted further toward the Republicans from 2012 to 2016 than Ohio 6 did from 2012 to 2016. And I personally think, I think it's possible, frankly, that Trump could do even better in parts of Eastern Ohio and maybe some of the more rural parts of the state than he did in 2016. Most people seem to think that Trump will fall off a little bit because his overall position is a little bit weaker. But if Biden's going to win the state, it's going to require him getting obviously really big margins, bigger than Clinton got in the three big urban areas, but then also cutting Trump's big rural margins across the state. He can't lose Ohio 6 by 42 points again. Maybe if he loses it by 32 or 35, that would, and he has similar kinds of gains across the state. Maybe that would be a model for how to win Ohio. But the bottom line is that you're going to hear a lot of talk about Biden improving in the suburbs, which again, I think is going to happen. That might be good enough on its own to flip states that were closer in 2016, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. It's not enough to flip Ohio. Biden has to run markedly better in some of the rural small town areas than Clinton did. Let me talk about the Senate really quick. Part of the reason that the Democrats ended up losing a couple of net seats in 2018, even though it was overall a pretty good year for Democrats, is that they were defending just a lot more seats than the Republicans were. Democrats were defending 26 of the 35 seats being contested, and they ended up losing two net seats. They were defending a lot of states that had become very Republican, like Indiana, Missouri, and North Dakota. This time, the shoe's on the other foot to some degree, in that of the 35 seats being contested, the Republicans are defending 23 of them. The Democrats are only defending 12. And so the Republicans are naturally a little bit overextended in the race for the Senate. Although notice, if you look at the states we have Senate races this year, a lot of them are really very reliably Republican. So states like Idaho and Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, the Democrats don't really have any chance of winning those states. So a lot of these seats are relatively easy holds for the Republicans. Right now, the Republicans have a 53 to 47 Senate majority. Although practically speaking, you could almost look at it like it's 54-46 for the Republicans, because the seat that's likeliest to flip from one party to the other right now is Alabama. The Senate seat held by Doug Jones, the Democrat who won a special election quite surprisingly, in December 2017. He is running for a full term this time against Tommy Tuberville, the former Auburn football coach. Tuberville is pretty strongly favored to beat Jones, and Alabama is a very Republican state. So the Republicans have that pickup kind of in their back pocket, I think anyway, and most people seem to think. And so in order to get to at least a 50-50 tie in the Senate that Democrats hope that a Vice President Kamala Harris would break, the Democrats have to beat at least win at least four current Republican-held Senate seats. Two of them we have the Democrats favored in against Republican Cory Gardner in Colorado and against Republican Martha McSally in the Arizona special election. We have three toss-ups, Republican Tom Tillis in North Carolina, Susan Collins, Republican of Maine, and then Joni Ernst, Republican of Iowa. Basically, I think if either side wins two of those three races, they've probably got the inside track to getting a Senate majority. There are other competitive seats in places like Georgia. There are actually two Senate races in Georgia this year, both of which might go to runoffs, and the runoffs would be in early January. So there might be two Senate seats that are actually undecided until early January. Democrats are really hoping that sitting governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, can really put a scare into Republican Senator Steve Daines in that state. There are other kind of longer shot Democratic targets, Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, John Cornyn in Texas. We have the Republicans pretty much favored in those places, but maybe there would be an upset in one of those. Bottom line is, I think that the race for the Senate is very close, and that if Biden doesn't win the presidency, I don't see how Republicans lose the Senate. Part of the reason for that is that vice presidential tie-breaking vote could really matter. And, if Republicans hold the presidency, Democrats need to pick up 5 seats as opposed to 4 just to get to 51, which if you look at this map, you could see how maybe they could do it. But I think it's kind of a tricky path. And finally, in the House, Democrats took control of the U.S. House in 2018. They're pretty much favored to keep it, even though the Democrats have a lot of vulnerable seats across the country. The Republicans, I don't think, did a particularly good job in terms of finding the best candidates for the best seats. A lot of these Democratic House incumbents have maybe weaker than expected Republican opponents. And also the Democrats generally have huge financial advantages, which, money's not everything, but you'd rather have more money than less in these elections. And right now, I think we favor that's maybe not all that much net change in the House. The House is 235 to 200 Democratic right now. So there are a lot of competitive races. The one to watch in Ohio is Steve Chabot in the 1st Congressional District. He had a tough race in 2018, although his opponent ended up having some problems. I think he has a stronger opponent this time in Kate Schroeder, who's a first-time candidate, Democrat. That's a district that is usually Republican, but if Biden is going to make big inroads in the state's metro areas, I could imagine Biden maybe carrying that district. Trump won it by 7 points in 2016. So that's really the one to watch. And then a few of the other races are kind of borderline competitive. Mike Turner in Ohio 10, Troy Balderson in Ohio 12, maybe Dave Joyce in Ohio 14. On the Democratic side, I think Tim Ryan, the Democrat from the Youngstown area, is going to be okay, but his district has actually become much more Republican over time. And that's like kind of, if you're looking for kind of a deep sleeper race to watch, that might be one. Bottom line here, I do think the presidential race is still close. I think you'd rather be Biden than Trump at this point, but I don't feel super strongly about it. And I think if Biden were to win, that's probably enough juice to get the Democrats to 50 Senate seats. So I guess the likeliest scenario to me for 2021 is that the Democrats would have unified control of Washington, although probably if they have a Senate majority at all, it would be a very small one. So it might be harder for them to do some of their big picture legislative agenda items. Second likeliest would be Democratic president, Republican Senate, Democratic House. Third likeliest would be maintenance of the status quo. Trump wins, Republicans hold the Senate, Democrats hold the House. And then you may have, there's still the possibility of the the Republicans holding or winning everything. Although again, I think the political environment would have to change a lot for the House to flip, let alone the Senate, the presidential stuff is more competitive. So anyway, I know I threw a lot at you there, but that's sort of our general sense of things. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions any of you all might have for our remaining time here.
Yeah. Thank you, Kyle, for all of that. I do have a couple questions that were sent in to me. The first question is, do you think Biden, if successful in November, would have significant coattails for members of the House or Senate?
I think everyone is muted. Although if you want to use the chat to type in a question or something, feel free to do that as well.
He can't hear you.
Kyle, can you hear me?
No, he can't.
No. Huh. I don't know why that's not working.
Oh, wait a second. I had my own sound on my computer muted.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Sorry about that.
Okay.
I saw the light blinking, or I saw your light lit up, but
well, good. That means you didn't hear all the things we were saying about you during your presentation. So you're good. You're good.
Yeah, I
had a couple questions sent in to me.
Great. Okay.
So do you think Biden, if successful in November, would have significant coattails for members of the House or Senate? And if so, would this translate to individual state races such as governors, state Supreme Courts, et cetera?
Yeah, I do think, look, we're in a time where we're very polarized politically, and there's not as much ticket splitting as there used to be. And so if Trump does well or if Biden does well, they're gonna lift up some of their own candidates, and that's where I think really you could see Democrats doing well in the U.S. House in particular, because there are lots of districts like Ohio 1 that Biden might outright carry, and that would potentially bring some of these Democrats over the finish line in district like that. Balderson's district, Ohio 12, is another one. Although I don't see that one as engaged as Ohio 1 is. And the state Supreme Court is really, that's the kind of, to me, kind of the marquee thing going on in Ohio this year, in that the Democrats have this Democrats could actually win a majority on the court, and it's a nonpartisan race, and I wonder if the Republicans would wish that those actually were partisan races right now, because the Democrats were able to win those two in 2018, and run a lot better than the statewide executive candidates did. So that's really something that I'm curious about in Ohio, but I don't necessarily have a sense as to how those state races are going. My understanding is the Democrats are relatively confident, but I haven't really heard a ton about
it. Speaking of Ohio, obviously, we have had a strong anti-Trump contingent amongst Republicans. Do you think that has an impact on voters? These former Republicans that are running or that are doing ads for Biden?
Also, I mean, it was kind of noteworthy. You've got the former Republican governor of the state, speaking at the Democratic convention in favor of Joe Biden. And, it was interesting, by the time Governor Kasich left office, he was more popular with Democrats than he was with Republicans, which you never would have predicted at the start of the, certainly at the start of Kasich's governorship in 2011. I think, if it matters, it probably matters at the margins. I will say, though, that, if you look at the 2016 presidential primary results in Ohio and where Kasich did really well, some of his best places were where he lives, the kind of northern Columbus suburbs. And those are places where Trump was a little bit weaker than Romney. And I think you're probably going to see Biden do even better than Hillary Clinton did. And so those kinds of voices, I think, are emblematic of some of the kinds of voters that are leaving the Republican Party. But at the same time, particularly in a state like Ohio, you've got a lot of lapsed kind of working class, maybe culturally conservative Democratic voters, particularly in places like Youngstown, Warren, Columbiana County, et cetera, that are migrating into the Republican Party. You know, that Donald Trump was a better Republican for them than Mitt Romney was, and those are voters who were resistant to Republicans in the past, and they're crossing the aisle too. You know, this trade-off that's going on, sort of kind of white-collar suburbanites toward the Democrats, blue-collar, small-town, rural voters from Democrats to Republicans. That trade has worked poorly for Republicans in certain states like Colorado and Virginia, for instance, that have kind of booming suburban areas, a little more diverse than Ohio is, et cetera. But in a state like Ohio, that trade-off has worked really well for Republicans, this changing coalition. And frankly, it's good for Republicans across the Midwest. And it's part of the reason that Trump won in 2016 and why he may retain certain advantages in those states, even in a somewhat weakened position in 2020.
And regardless of who wins the presidency, if it is close, what do you think the likelihood is that the loser, the non-winning candidate, goes to the Supreme Court and challenges it?
It depends how close it is, and this is actually something I was going to mention in my kind of formal remarks, but I'll mention it here. The vote count is going to be a lot different than what we're used to, and what we're seeing is that so there's, you know, because of COVID, more people are going to want to vote by mail because they don't want to, you know, vote in person for obvious reasons. Although I do think that now that we're several months into this and people have been out and about and they go to the grocery store, et cetera, that ultimately voting may not seem like such a task as maybe it might have if the coronavirus was new to us. But what you see in some of the data that we have about who's requesting absentee ballots, this is true in Ohio, it's true in other states too, that Democrats seem much likelier to vote by mail this year, to vote early in person, which is not an option in all states, but it is an option in Ohio. And whereas Republicans are going to be likelier to vote on election day. Some states will count the early and mail votes first. Some states will count the in-person votes first. One of the states that it's going to count the in-person votes first is Pennsylvania. And so what's going to happen on election night, in all likelihood, is that whatever the outcome in Pennsylvania ends up being, Donald Trump is going to be leading in Pennsylvania on election night. I feel pretty confident saying that. If he's not, he's in huge trouble. Because what we saw in the primary was that it seemed like many more self-identified Republicans voted in Pennsylvania on election night, or in June, and then when it was all sorted out and all the votes were counted, registered Democrats had actually cast more votes. But what you could see is the president declaring victory in Pennsylvania, for instance, even though many of the votes haven't been counted yet, and people are going to have to realize that, you know, we have to wait for these vote counts to get finalized. Some states like Florida's going to be really fast. Florida always counts its votes fast. It's also usually very close. We've seen a lot of litigation there. One thing about mail-in ballots too, and you may encounter this yourself. I just had a friend of mine who lives in Cleveland who was telling me that she was kind of confused about how to where the proper place to sort of fold the ballot was and where to sign it, et cetera. But because so many people are using mail-in ballots, they're going to be lawyers, you know, looking at the ballots and trying to determine whether they've been filled out properly, they've been counted properly, disputes about whether ballots get thrown out or not. So there's certainly going to be litigation there. And again, you know, depending on how close this is, that's where you start to see a scenario that you described, that maybe the courts have to get involved, that it's like 2000 all over again. But I would say that the thing preventing us from a kind of weeks-long battle here is, you know, obviously if the election isn't that close, and Florida, I think, is probably the state to watch for that, because if either Trump or Biden wins Florida by more than a point or two, that probably points to them winning overall. In fact, there are some parts of Florida that have so many transplants from the Midwest that at certain parts of Florida kind of vote like the Midwest, particularly like in the Tampa area. And so if we see big changes toward either candidate in those places, that would probably be a suggestion that some of the Midwest is also shifting that way as well. So Florida is whoever you're rooting for, root for Florida to have a decisive outcome, because that's how we'll know if the election overall might be decisive.
Okay. Final question is, well, I guess there's two more questions. One, many people last election pointed to, I'm voting for Trump because of his ability to pick Supreme Court justices. Do you see that as being an issue this time? And do you see Biden maybe proactively announcing who he's considering? Does that change people's opinions?
Biden did say that he would appoint a black woman to the court, but he didn't specify specifically who that might be. But he did suggest that he was going to he was going to do that. I think that part of why Trump specifically named Supreme Court candidates in 2016 was that he was trying to reassure conservatives that he was going to be reliable on those sorts of issues. I don't know if Republicans really need that sort of assurance now, because Brett Kavanaugh, is certainly someone that, and Neil Gorsuch are certainly candidates that any Republican, I think, would have nominated Supreme Court. The president made an announcement recently that he was considering a number of other folks, including some sitting members of the Senate, like Ted Cruz. And I do think that control of the court is a very important issue for a lot of voters, and that even these issues kind of keep voters in line. In that we're in a kind of very partisan era. It's kind of hard to get people to change parties and to cross over. And control of the court is part of the reason for that, because if you're very strongly pro-choice or pro-life, and you're being asked to vote for a candidate who's the opposite of you on abortion and will appoint justices who are going to undermine your position on abortion, that's a tough pill to swallow for a lot of voters, and liberals and conservatives. And that, I think, that the salience of the court, I think, helps keep voters kind of in line and in their partisan camps.
And then I guess the final question, unless anybody else has another one, based upon COVID-19, the way that candidates have not been able to travel quite as extensively, host the number of events that they do, do you think that has any long-term effect on future campaigns?
I do think, I do wonder if the conventions will get sort of scaled back based on, I actually thought some of the features of the conventions, like the roll call by that went to all the states that the Democrats did, I thought that was kind of cool. I think there was some other, the president did his speech at the White House, which was sort of, it wasn't necessarily unprecedented, although I guess it was for a convention. That might be part of it. One advantage the Republicans might have is that they've been more willing, and the Trump campaign has been more willing to do door knocking for Trump, and the Biden camp, because of COVID, has decided to hold off on that. The political science research indicates that, in terms of campaign methods, you're not going to, a lot of these things are only matter on the margins, but if you're going to be doing campaigning, you're better to do it door to door than you are to do it by phone or email or what have you. So that might be a little bit of an advantage for the Trump campaign. And I do think that, if Trump were to pull out an upset, it might be that we would point to some of his campaign methods as a reason why, and that for the next campaign, the Democrats would be reminded that they need to do that as well. But I suspect that we're probably going to go back to more of kind of a normal campaign in 2024. But again, there might be certain pieces of this that remain a part of our, political life.
All right. Well, to leave everybody maybe in fear or to give them comfort, the president has said if Biden wins, stock markets will crumble, they'll fall exponentially. What do you think happens with the markets based upon who wins? If Biden wins?
You might see a little bit of retrenchment in the markets based on the result if Biden were to win. I'm not much of an expert on the machinations of the stock market. I mean, I think it's kind of amazing that we've gone through such a bad economic year for so many people, and yet the markets seem to really be doing fine. I think there may be a real disconnect between the markets and kind of the day-to-day economic life of some people. Although, obviously some sectors are devastated by what's been going on. Other sectors aren't really affected much at all. I do think, a unified democratic government, I do think that they would they probably would raise taxes, at least on some people. They'd be trying to do more programs. I'd assume that the regulatory environment would get a little more aggressive in certain ways. But I also think that Biden, even the president seems to indicate this in his messaging. Biden is not as liberal as the most liberal parts of the Democratic Party. It just then is a question of, if he is elected, how far left does he go? What does he try to prioritize? And does he have the votes particularly in the Senate to do those things? I mean, again, I could certainly imagine a world in which Biden wins but doesn't have the Senate, in which case it might be hard for him to even fill judicial vacancies, let alone pass big picture legislation.
Okay. Well, Kyle, I can't thank you enough for coming on and talking to us. Based upon some of the comments I've gotten, people very much enjoyed it. Your insight is always terrific. If I can make a pitch for you, Sabato's Crystal Ball still free, the newsletter?
Yeah, we come out, actually, it used to be once a week. We're doing kind of twice a week now. We've got a video podcast series too that you can find on YouTube. It's also linked on our newsletter, but our YouTube channel is UVA-CFP. That's University of Virginia Center for Politics. We're also, it also is just up on Apple Podcasts now. So if you just search Sabato's Crystal Ball, we have the weekly podcast in addition to the newsletter. We're following this stuff, making updates every week, and trying to keep tabs on everything. I mean, I think that again, I think that particularly in the kind of the heights of the summertime, there was maybe this feeling that Biden was in sort of a runaway position, and I'd rather be him than Trump, but I don't really. I do think Trump can make a comeback here, so I would be just be aware of that.
Okay. Well, Kyle, thank you very much for your time. We greatly appreciate it, and look forward to seeing your updates.
And thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.